Hello again.
Welcome back.
Yeah, excited to be here. Thank you for joining us at Living Richly with Curo.
Yes, welcome back. My name is Anne McCabe. I am the CEO and a partner here at Curo Private Wealth. And as always, I'm joined by my amazing partner, Teresa.
Hi, I'm Teresa Roberts, COO and partner here with Anne at Curo Private Wealth.
Yeah, so happy to be back with you. This week, our topic is what we're going to call Estate Planning 101. Not the most fun thing to talk about,
No,
admittedly, but one of the most important.
absolutely. Absolutely. And always better to talk about it before it gets to be too late.
Exactly. But we're never going to die. So why do we
Of
actually need to
course.
do estate planning?
Who needs to? We're
Just
going to live
kidding.
forever.
Exactly. More to follow on that. But first, one of my
Mhm.
favorite parts of every week is our A team catch up. So, what do you have for us, Teresa? How are you doing this week?
I'm doing okay. Loving the weather. I realize how much I just need sunshine. So just having longer days of it, even when I'm now in the office late, I leave and it's still light outside. That is refreshing even now during the summer. So that's really, I think, helping my mood in general. But other than that, just gearing up for summer, got some fun trips planned, but we've also got some internal projects planned. We've got interns who've joined us this summer. So a lot of fun things, but not much exciting on the personal front, though. I know everybody's sick of hearing about my golf tales, so I'll spare us this week. But nothing else really new to report. How about you?
I think we'll never get sick of your golf tales personally, but that's just me. That's just me. I'm doing well. I think my theme for this week is music. I
Mm,
went with my partner. I'm going to call him Wally. I decided
okay. Oh, I like
that's the
that.
name I'm going to use. Wally and I went to Chris Stapleton on Friday at Jiffy Lube Live. This was my Christmas present from him. So it's, June and I had to wait a long time, but it was worth the wait. He was amazing. And it was just so fun. It was fun to be outside and fun to
Yeah.
hear live music. And, during COVID, we obviously couldn't do that. So I'm just remembering as I'm getting back out there with concerts how much I love listening to live music. And then last night, I actually went into DC with my mom to a piano concert, which was
Nice.
great. Very different, obviously. Yeah, it was really fun. Very different vibe than the Chris Stapleton. But what they both
I'm
have in
sure.
common what they both have in common is as I was observing these two very different musicians, I 100% could tell that they're both like living their calling. You know what I mean? Like so much passion, so much in the moment, in the zen, in the flow. And that was really admirable. Again, very different situations and scenarios and styles of music obviously, but the pianist that we saw last night, he was probably in his 60s and he started playing the piano when he was 6, and
Oh.
he was playing these really challenging pieces, classical, Chopin and things like that. My wonderful French accent.
I think that was pretty good.
But he was playing, thank you, I appreciate it. So he was playing this music without looking at music. It was just all memory, and these are really, really challenging pieces. So anyway, it just got me thinking, like, just the admiration that I have for people who have found their life's work, their dharma, their calling, and how incredible it is to be in their presence of just that excellence and honing their craft and continuing to try to get better, even though they've been doing this for years and years.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And speaking of music, now that you bring it up, and for those of you listening or watching who might be in the DC area, at I believe it's the Portrait Gallery in the Sculpture Garden, every Friday between Memorial Day and Labor Day, they do Jazz in the Gardens. It's a Friday
Ooh.
outdoor picnic style. You bring, a blanket or a chair, and there's some different band. Sometimes it's jazz, but sometimes it's different styles of music. So my friends and I actually, because you have to apply in like a lottery to get tickets every week. So we actually got tickets for Friday of this week. So I'll let you know how that goes. It's probably going to be really hot, but
Ooh,
so we'll be out doing that. So maybe music is the theme this summer. I love that.
that's amazing. That sounds awesome. I would love to do that. And it's such a beautiful setting.
Yeah, and if you've never been, it's really fun. You can bring your own snacks and things, but then they also have a bar where you can buy pitchers of sangria, that kind of thing. It's just a really casual, laid back, just real summer, easy kind of a vibe, which is always really nice.
It sounds like the perfect summer plans.
Yeah, break it up. You can't play golf every week.
Or in addition to golf, either way.
Right.
All right. So this week we are going to dive into estate planning 101. And as we kicked off by saying, not the most fun thing we talk with clients about, but so important. And I promise you, if you haven't done estate planning for yourself yet, once you get through the process, which is not fun, I'm not going to
Right.
sugarcoat it. But once you get through the process, you will feel such amounts of peace of mind knowing that if something were to happen to you, God forbid, at least your affairs are in order and at least things are organized and people know what they're supposed to do and how it's all supposed to work. So, we're going to kick off today's episode with a little trivia. So, Teresa, what do Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr.,
Okay.
Pablo Picasso, Bob Marley, and Michael Jackson all have in common?
Not all musicians, not all were
Nope.
assassinated. I'm not sure, Anne. What
Nope.
what do they all have in common?
They all died without a will in place.
Yikes.
Yeah, yikes is right. And these are people who know better and
Right.
have had in the past tense, had all of the resources for the most part. No excuse, right? So this
No.
is it's again a very human nature thing to be in denial a bit about our death. And it's one of those things where you're like, yeah, it's on the list, I know I need to take care of it, but it's not a good time, I'm busy with other things, and I'll keep kick it to the back burner. And honestly, this is one of the topics that we talk with clients about over and over
Yes.
again. We check in with them, we make sure it's done or it's in process. And it's one of the benefits of working with an advisor who can hold you accountable to do some of these things that are not fun, very easy to procrastinate on, but incredibly important.
Right. Absolutely. And when I typically run into either clients or maybe even friends and family who are reluctant to have the conversation, I always remind them that estate planning is not for you. Right. You'll be dead. You won't care. Estate planning is for the loved ones you leave behind who then become responsible. And don't you want to make their life as easy as possible as they're also processing your loss? So don't think about it as something you're doing for yourself. You're doing it for the people you love, whether that's a child or a sibling or a partner or even just a really close friend. Get motivated to make those choices to make life a little bit easier on them. They're already dealing with the fact that you're gone, right? So if we can relieve them of the stress of also trying to figure out your stuff, then that's why you want to be motivated to make those decisions as well.
Such a good point. It's a gift. It's a gift to your
Right,
loved ones, whether
absolutely.
that is family members or friends. Yeah, great point. So let's start off with just an easy definition of what is estate planning.
Mm.
And the way that we would describe estate planning is a process of arranging your affairs to ensure that when you pass, your assets and your belongings are distributed according to your wishes. But also, an important component of estate planning that a lot of people don't think about is making sure your affairs are taken care of in the event that you are still alive, but you become incapacitated. That is incredibly important as well, because if something happens to you and you are unable to make decisions, you must name someone or someone must step into your shoes to take care of your affairs while you are not able to make those decisions. So I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about when they think about estate planning. They think about just the death piece, but the if I'm alive and incapacitated piece is quite important as well.
Yeah, and we see many cases where a person starts to face cognitive decline. And the challenging part about that sort of issue is that your physical body could remain healthy for a really long time as you're experiencing these cognitive issues. So we see that a lot in conversations we have with our clients, and why it's so important to make sure you know who it is you want to be able to make those decisions for you. Should you still, like you say, are you're still present and alive, but just are not capable of making the choices or handling it yourself.
Exactly. So, Teresa, why don't you share with us just high level, what are the key components that make up an estate plan?
Yeah, so I usually think of them as the big three, and maybe this is probably as the big three sub B as well. But there are typically three basic sorts of documents we start when we're talking through estate planning with clients that they want to make sure that they at least consider having. Of course, the big one that I think lots of people are familiar with are wills and trust. And of course, those are the documents that dictate how assets, not just investments, but everything, property, china, jewelry, cars, everything that you own. They spell out how those assets get passed. Wills are slightly different from trust in that wills, of course, have to still go through what's called the probate process. So it still has to go basically before the court. The court designates who's responsible for that estate through the will by either naming an executor or executrix or an administrator. And then that person becomes responsible for carrying out the instructions in the will. Trusts are a little bit different in that they typically are handled privately. They don't have to go through a probate process. And whomever is named the successor trustee is the person responsible for making sure that the instructions of the trust are carried out. The second one would be powers of attorney. And again, this speaks to the case of when you are still alive and are unable to make choices for yourself. Powers of attorney become inactive once the person passes away. So they only act in the case of when you're still living. But it basically allows you to designate who is responsible for making decisions for you, who can sign documents on your behalf. And there are different versions of them. There are durable powers of attorney, which we typically want to recommend because those will cover incapacitation as well. And then there are also just things that are more specific, like a financial power of attorney. This person can sign my checks or open bank accounts for me. But that is one of the second of the big three we want to consider. And then the other, of course, is healthcare directives, or what some estate attorneys might call a living will. And it's basically saying, who can make medical decisions for you? Who can decide? Like if you're a person who decides, you know what, I don't want to ever be on any sort of a life support. I want to sign a DNR. Those are the things that we spell out in healthcare directives. And not only do we want to put them in documents, we want to also have the conversation with the person so that they understand truly what your wishes are. And then sort of that sub B part, and this is probably more tagged to things like wills and trust, but is asset titling and beneficiary designations. And these are ways that we can transfer assets by what we call contract, right? By where we can say officially, if something happens to me, I want this person to have this part of my assets. And we can tag beneficiaries to investment accounts, to checking accounts. I mean, even in some states, you can assign a beneficiary to a vehicle title. I know state of Maryland allows that for a small fee. So those are ways typically where you can pass assets without having to go through the hassle of, let's say, like the probate process. So those are essentially the key components of your estate planning arsenal, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, and just to double click on that asset
Mm-hmm.
titling and beneficiary, this is a free thing you can do. So, this is a
Mm-hmm.
very powerful estate planning aspect that you don't have to go see an attorney to do. So, it is totally free. And it's incredibly important to make sure, number one, that your beneficiary designations are in place and they are the correct person. And number two, that your assets are titled properly. For example, if you are a single individual and you have an individual checking savings account and you do not have a beneficiary designated, Banks will call this a POD, or payable on death, is the way that you add a beneficiary to a checking or savings account. If you don't have that beneficiary listed, then that asset has to go through probate, as Teresa was mentioning, which is a process. It's a court process. It takes time. There are fees associated. So those assets are effectively illiquid and tied up until it gets through the court process. Versus if you have that POD listed, then that person, the beneficiary, takes over as the owner of that asset once you pass away. So incredibly important, very easy. Something we see quite frequently is people don't have PODs on their bank, their checking accounts, savings accounts, or TODs on their investment accounts. Works exactly the same way, just with your investment account versus your checking and savings. The other thing I want to mention about beneficiaries, for example, on life insurance policies, IRAs, 401ks, these trump your will. Let me just say that again. These trump your will. So if you have in your will, let's say you were married and you went through a divorce and you have a new partner, you remarried. If your will says everything goes to my new spouse, but you forgot to change the beneficiary and your ex-spouse is still listed as the beneficiary on your life insurance policies, 401ks, etc., and you pass, guess who's getting those assets?
The ex.
Yeah, the ex-spouse, the ex-spouse. And there have been numerous cases that have gone through the system where people are like, no, but I'm married to this person and I deserve those assets. And the judges, every time that I've seen, have said, yeah, I understand, but you have to change those beneficiary documents, and that was not done. And so these assets are rightly the ex-spouse's. So super, super important to make sure not only that that will is in place, but also that your beneficiary documents are on your accounts and accurate to who you want to receive your assets in the event that you pass.
Yep, absolutely. And just also a little note, because I also have run into situations where clients have those old 401ks that they never consolidated or rolled over. And sometimes when they're out of sight, out of mind, you want to check those too. Make sure those beneficiaries are also correct. Because again, as Ann mentioned, if something happens to you, whomever is on that old account is going to receive those assets, whether you like it or not.
Exactly. So, a couple other things to mention on wills. This is where you name an executor. So, as Teresa mentioned, if when you pass and your will has to go through the probate process, the executor is the person who is responsible for basically managing that process and making sure that your assets and belongings are distributed according to your wishes. If you have minor children, this is also where you designate a guardian for them in your will. Really, really, really important, if you have children, that you make the decision while you are alive who would take over as a guardian. Because guess what? If you don't do that, the court makes that decision for you. And I'm a mom and I can't even fathom the idea of a judge making that decision about my children
Right.
versus me, knowing who is in my family or who could really step in. So in the event that you were to pass, or you and your spouse were to pass and you had minor children, having that guardian in place, very important. And then lastly, as Teresa mentioned, it also goes through how to distribute assets and who gets what. But remember, those beneficiary documents trump whatever your will says.
Yeah, I want to, and again, in Anne's words, we're going to double click. If you have children, please have the conversations around guardianship, because you want to think that families are all, sane and healthy and and have a great dynamic. But as we know in real life, that is not the actual case for lots of people. So just because someone may be assumed your next of kin by a court doesn't necessarily mean that's the person or those are the people that you would want responsible for raising your children. So it's incredibly important to have the conversations, make sure your family understands the plans for your children, and then document it in your will so that there is nothing left to question should something happen to you.
Exactly. All right. So next up, let's talk a little bit more about trusts and the different kinds of trusts that we commonly see. This doesn't go over all the trusts, but what are the ones that we commonly see, and kind of what do they mean, or what are the differences?
Yeah, so one of the big ones that we see more often than not are revocable living trust. These are trusts where you, as what is known as the grantor or the person funding the trust, retains that control during your lifetime. So in most cases, when we set up, let's say, for example, a investment account or brokerage account in the title of a trust, the grantor is still the trustee. And then we also just open up that account in that person's social security number. So they're still your assets. You still own them, and you still get to make decisions about what happens to it during your lifetime. The good thing about trust, and I slightly mentioned it before about revocable trust, is though that after your passing, the trust is going to tell the story of what happens to those assets when you're no longer here. And trust also allow you to tell the story for multiple generations. So if you are a person who wants to have some control over what happens to assets, not just for siblings or children, but also for grandchildren and nieces and nephews, and how you want to be able to support them in the future, a trust can be a very good tool for that. And like I also mentioned, it avoids the probate process. So you can also manage the transferring of assets privately, whereas probate are typically public court records. Then there are what we call irrevocable trust, or these are trusts where you fund them, but you lose control of the assets once they're there. Typically, we see them have their own tax ID number because you're going to see it as its own entity, right? This is a trust that you're funding to hold assets separately from you. Some people will use them to be able to save money on estate taxes by moving assets out of their own estate. In many cases, we may also see it where a revocable trust that had, let's say, one living grantor, that person passes, and then that trust then becomes irrevocable because, of course, now that the person who wrote the story of the trust is no longer here, that story can't be rewritten. So we typically retitle it to make it irrevocable, and that way nothing changes about what you designated when you were living. But the main key to that part is that you do lose control, but it does provide you some creditor protection and help to save on estate taxes should something happen if you have pretty big estates. There are also things like special needs trust, where you can set them up to be for the benefit of, let's say, a child with special needs or a family member with special needs. And it's so that you can protect so that you can protect benefits that they may be receiving, let's say, from the state, right? By them not owning the assets outright, it still allows them to be eligible for some federal or state benefits that they may not have access to if they themselves own too many assets. So it allows you to fund a trust that is still for their benefit and can still be used for their care, but where that person does not own the assets outright. And then there are charitable trusts, and these are typically done for people who are philanthropic, who want to make sure that they are gifting to charitable organizations. And you can typically combine that with your estate planning, but as well, even as, during your lifetime, a funding trust so that you're ensured that charities can benefit from your estate once you have passed on.
Yeah. So one of the things about revocable trusts, especially if you have minor children, that is really important is, as Teresa was mentioning, and I love this idea of you writing the story while you're still alive. One of the key things that parents want to think about is how their children or grandchildren are going to receive inheritances. So I've told my children that in my trust, they're not getting anything until they're 60. Because I don't want them to, I don't want them to not work. I don't want them to not make their own life and make their own money and make their own path. And they don't think that's very funny, by the way, but I think it's hilarious. So, but the point is that you can decide at what stages or for what reasons your children can have access to your assets. Now, generally, most trusts have language that they can access money in the trust for healthcare, for maintenance, for education. So, they're not going to be on the street. but it will not allow a crazy purchase, which my boys would totally do, of like a Ferrari or, Lamborghini or something like that. That'd be like the first thing that they would do, I'm confident. So it allows you to really kind of put protections in place where you're still taking care of them, but you're not making it so easy for them that they don't live their own life. And we've seen countless stories where younger children inherit assets and it ruins them.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the same way, and this is actually a real life pretty, I say it's funny. It's probably not funny to the person though, but I have dealt with in recent years a real life situation where in this case, it would be the grandmother who in her trust left money to her grandson. And let's say it's around the tune of about $150,000. The stipulation written in the trust for him to receive that money was earning a bachelor's degree before he turned 25. The trust also spelled out that the family could access the assets in the trust to pay for that education. So he could essentially go to school paid for. He just had to attain the degree before he turned 25. And if he didn't, the money would then go to a charity, to a convent in New York. Let's just say 25 came and went and the bachelor's degree was not attained. And then I was forced to have the difficult conversation with this beneficiary that according to this trust, we now have to start gifting this money to this convent. And he basically lost 100. And at the time, I think it was about $165,000 just because he never finished school. So that's just how powerful trust can be in telling the story for what you want to happen with assets, even if your beneficiaries don't find it very funny.
Yeah. Sometimes we'll call it controlling your assets from the grave.
Right.
Which is a funny visual, but it's kind of the way it works. So,
yeah.
Anyway, all this to say, we started off by saying estate planning is a gift to your family and your friends and whoever is responsible for taking care of these things in the event that you were to pass. And my belief too is leaving assets to children or grandchildren in trust where there are protections. I don't care how responsible your, 21, 22-year-old is. They don't have the life experience. They probably don't have a lot of financial experience. So it really is a gift to give them these assets with some guardrails, with some protection, hopefully with some education around financial literacy and managing your money. And I do believe that it's a gift. And I believe based on our experience and what we've seen, that if you give a bunch of money to your kids outright, it really actually can be detrimental. People think they're helping or they're supporting, but I do believe that it actually can be detrimental if they don't have the foundation in place ahead of time. All right. So, a couple other things we wanted to share about how estate planning works and specifically around estate taxes. The government gives us what's called an estate exemption, and this number changes every year. One, due to inflation, and two, due to tax laws and changes that Congress decides to make. But the current exemption right now is about $13.6 million per person. So double that for a couple. So we're talking about a very large amount of money that we can pass to our beneficiaries estate tax free. Now, if you are married and you pass away, that exemption is unlimited to go to your spouse. So where this exemption would really come in is the second of the two of you passing and talking about non-spousal beneficiaries. But the reality is the majority of Americans right now with the current laws are not facing probably a big estate tax issue because of the very large exemption that we have. So again, as long as your estate, which is adding up all of your assets, your life insurance, death benefit, your belongings, everything, as long as that number is not over $13.6 million, your non-spousal beneficiaries will not, or your estate really will not have to pay a tax. So very large exemption that we're working off of right now. Now, the TCJA that was passed a few years ago, that the tax cuts effectively are set to expire the end of 2025, and that exemption is set to sunset and it's going to sunset back to 5 million, but it will be adjusted for inflation. So the current estimate is somewhere around 6 million. So we're going from, over $13.5 million of an exemption to potentially down to 6, still a nice amount of money, obviously. But our expectation is many more families will find themselves in a situation where they have to do different estate planning around taxes. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, if Congress acts and extends the tax cuts, then we could be in a different situation. That is all to be determined, but that is currently what we're working off, is the assumption that the exemption goes back down to around $6 million beginning in 2026. The other number we like to share with folks, especially if you do find yourself in a situation where you're trying to reduce your estate because you're concerned about estate taxes, is a strategy called gifting. And there are lots of different ways that you can do this, but the number to be aware of for this year is $18,000, or double that, $36,000 if you're married. So each of us is allowed to give $18,000 to whomever we would like to, estate tax free and gift tax free. So if I wanted to give a Teresa $18,000 and I want to give my kids $18,000 each, and I want to give my partner $18,000, etc., I am able to do that. I don't have to file a separate gift tax return. I don't have to report it. They don't pay taxes on it. It's a complete kind of free and clear gift. So this is a way that when we're dealing with clients' estates that are very large and we're concerned about estate taxes, this is one of the strategies that we may implement, and we do implement with them. So lastly, let's talk about some mistakes that we see frequently, Teresa, when we're dealing with
Yeah.
clients and estate planning. Now, we're not attorneys, we're not creating these documents for clients, but we are very involved, obviously, in our clients' financial positions and know what their wishes are and make sure they get these proper documents in place. But what are some of the big mistakes we see over and over again when we're doing financial planning for clients?
Yeah, the biggest mistake is not doing it, right? Is not doing the estate planning. And I think a lot of people's hesitancy is around the idea that estate planning sounds very fancy and complicated and that it requires working with an attorney. But as we just went through, there are so many ways where you can set instructions for your estate that don't require you to spend any money. Assigning beneficiaries is completely free to you. Now, while you will probably want to consult an attorney around creating the big three documents, right, the powers of attorneys and the wills or trust, many attorneys will do a simple estate planning package for you pretty cost efficiently. So don't let the idea that it's complicated or very expensive deter you from just not doing it. The other mistake we see is not funding the accounts like trust properly. A trust document is just that. It's a document. And even though you may have named a trust and you've written out your story and you've even opened an account in the name of that trust, until you fund it, right? Until you actually move assets into the name and ownership of that trust, it doesn't matter. So if you have created trust, you want to make sure that you are working with a financial professional who can help to title accounts appropriately so that they are actually owned by the trust and that those accounts are funded, because the story written in your trust is only going to apply to the things the trust owns. So be sure that you're actually funding the trust. And then, of course, updating beneficiaries is another mistake, which we've already touched on a little bit. You want to be reviewing those and making sure that beneficiaries are in place. Even if it's the same person, even if it's just a spouse, you want to make sure that that person's name is actually assigned as beneficiary to those accounts. The other big mistake is forgetting about the healthcare power of attorney. Many people will think about their like durable or general powers of attorney, and then they don't realize the importance of actually having that healthcare POA or that healthcare directive. That is really important, especially if you're ever in the place where you're incapacitated and can't make the decisions for yourself. You want to be sure that that is in place so that your wishes are carried out. That's what's important, right? That the things that you want to happen to and for you actually happen. And then, of course, forgetting about Digital assets is now a big one too. So many people now are establishing online savings accounts, right? Where there's no brick and mortar bank they walk into, they don't have physical checkbooks. Everything they do is via app. You want to make sure that those you are monitoring the beneficiary and titling for as well, because those things can be easily forgotten. If you're playing around with Bitcoin or with other kinds of crypto, those are still considered your assets. And should something happen to you, it will become a part of your estate and will need to be transferred. So you want to also check on those digital assets and make sure that they're properly titled, the accounts they're in, and that they also have the appropriate beneficiaries.
Absolutely. I think that the number one that you went through of not doing estate planning too, some of the pushback I get from clients is not being sure exactly maybe who they want to name as an executor or a successor or trustee. And what we typically tell clients is it's much better to have something in place that may be 90% of the way there. It may not be perfect. You may not feel like this is exactly the plan that you want, but is it the best plan that you can possibly put into place with the people who you have in your life right now and the information you have in your life right now and the asset situation or net worth situation that you have right now? You can and probably will continuously update your estate plan as you go. So just put something in place that you feel pretty good about today and know you can always change your mind. Unless we're talking about those irrevocable trusts, you may not change your mind with those. But for the most part, everything else that we've talked about, get something in place and know that 5 years down the road, you should reassess it. You should take a look at, do I still have the right people in place? Do I still have the right documents for my financial position? Has something changed? We recommend that irrespective of life events, you look at your documents and potentially update them every 5 years. But certainly if you have a life event, let's say a death or a birth or a divorce, or you hear about a tax law change, those could impact you needing to go back and redo or relook at your estate planning documents. So my point is that for the most part, nothing has to be permanent. Get something in place that you feel relatively good about and know that you can and probably will make changes in the future, and that's quite all right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always recommend to clients, especially those who are still working and may have employer sponsored like 401ks or plans, is that open enrollment is a good time to review those things. Even though you may not be in an active enrollment period where you actually have to make new selections, it's just always a good reminder to go back and check those, check the 401k, make sure the beneficiary is correct, right? So it's just a good reminder during that time of the year to just go back and do a quick review of all of the other accounts and make sure that things are as the way you want them. And as Ann mentioned, for right now, right? It's not going to be perfect and the situations may change, but make the best decisions you can with the information you have available at the time.
Yeah. The other question we get sometimes is, do I really need to go see an attorney or can I do
Mm.
something online? There are all these very low cost ways to do things online. And our recommendation is generally we think you should go see an attorney. We think an attorney who knows your state laws. By the way, every state in the US has different estate laws. So we think that, somebody who's barred in your state and who is familiar, who does estate planning, not just kind of does estate planning on the side, but does estate planning and knows the laws is really important. Now, if you give me the option of having nothing or going to an online provider and getting something in place, I'll say, sure, go to the online provider, right? So that is better than nothing. But we have seen situations where online documents have language that is not accurate, and not valid for the state. And so you may end up paying more money in the long run versus if you just do it right the first time. So generally speaking, we're referring clients to professional attorneys who do estate planning to make sure that they are good to go and everything is accurate in their documents.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're always going to lean on the professionals. And as Ann mentioned, we're not estate attorneys ourselves. We typically partner with our clients' attorneys, but we're always going to defer to their professional guidance, just like we would want them to defer to ours for the investment and financial planning side. So it's always nice working with a professional. And then they also can help you go through the things that you might not be thinking of, right? A professional will also have the depth of experience and knowledge to think of those things that you may not be considering.
Exactly. All right. I think we've talked about pretty much all things estate planning for the week. So that wraps us up on that topic. So, what do you have for us this week, Atrisa, for a closing thought?
So closing thought this week, again, I think it's probably in the same vein of things that I've just kind of been on my mind a little bit more. And I think it plays into the idea of our podcast as well. It's just living just a more rich and happy and enjoyable life. And you mentioned in the beginning talking about watching musicians and seeing them sort of live in their purpose, right? And doing the things that you can tell that they love to do. And I realize, and I'm so grateful for it. And I've been trying to take the time to express that gratitude for that feeling where even though I get really busy and I get stressed and sometimes overwhelmed with work, that I feel like I'm really living my purpose, right? So the work is rewarding to me. Even when I'm busy, I still walk away knowing that I've made some difference. Or, even when you have those conversations with clients where you give them a little bit of clarity. So I'm just really grateful for that and trying not to think of just my work as separate from my life. So many of us like compartmentalize, like, oh, this is work and this is what I do. So much of what I do is who I am, and it's an active part of my life. And I'm really grateful to be able to do the things that I love. So I'm really trying to focus on being grateful for that and living a really just sort of full, happy life, both personally and professionally. That's my TED Talk. Thanks for listening.
Of course.
All right.
And as always, we have no idea what we're going to share. And oftentimes we're like connected. Today is no exception. My closing thought is exactly that. There's a term called dharma, which refers to us living our life calling, our life purpose, however you want to call it, and just doing work that is meaningful, that adds value to people, that brings joy to our lives. So it is exactly what you said is my closing thought too. And if you don't find yourself in a situation where your job, your career brings you joy, I would encourage you this week to reflect on what are those activities that do bring you joy. When can you be doing something and get so in the flow that time disappears and you have no idea where the hour just went? And maybe there could be something professionally, career wise, that you could do around that activity. So be really mindful about if your current career path job is not bringing you joy, be mindful about the things that do bring you joy and be open-minded and creative about possibly ways that you could create a career path in those areas. So that is my thought for you today. I am also incredibly grateful that I too believe I'm living my life purpose, my calling. I don't think of it as a job. I really do think of it as a calling. And I also think about it as an integration of my life. It's not, this is me at home and this is me at work. I think of my life as integrated, and running this firm with you and advising our clients is a huge part of who I am and my life, and something I'm really proud of and something that I'm incredibly grateful for as well.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah, and I think we're so lucky we get to do it together, and we get to do it with a team that actually respects and likes and enjoys working and being with one another. So even the hard days, are good days. So I'm appreciative of that.
Exactly. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. A couple quick reminders. If you enjoyed this episode, you got any sort of value out of it, please share the episode with someone you love or respect. Also, give us a 5-star review, subscribe so that you're alerted when we drop new episodes, which we do every week. And a new thing for you this week is we have a new email address that we created, podcast@curoprivatewealth.com. Again, podcast@curoprivatewealth.com. Our ask is that you send us financial questions that are on your mind that you would like for us to answer live on this podcast, because we want to be answering questions that are top of mind for you and that add value to you. So please feel free to use that email address and send us what is on your mind.
We're excited to hear from you.
Thanks again for tuning in. Until next week, we will see you then. Live a rich life and have a great weekend. Take care.
Bye.